Okay, we should be good to get started.
All right. Thank you very much, Lindsay. Hello to everyone, and welcome to our third VEDA VEDP Impact ED session focusing on the COVID-19 crisis. Hope everyone had a great Easter and everyone's staying healthy and safe out there. We have a great lineup today of speakers. Our first speaker will be Stephen Moret, VEDP, then Jody Keenan with the Small Business Development Center. Then we're going to have Zachary Petrie with the Virginia Community Capital, anxious to hear how the loan process is going. And our last speaker will be Chris Lloyd with McGuire Woods Consulting, give us a perspective from what's going on in the site selector world. I want to thank Lindsay Barker with VEDP for running and producing the show today. Connie may be calling in, but she is without electricity in Virginia Beach. Had a lot of high winds there this morning. I also want to remind everyone, a week from Friday, we'll have our second peer-to-peer learning session. So feel free to check that out and call in if you'd like to hear about how folks are dealing with this situation and share some of your ideas. That would be greatly appreciated. The rules of engagement today: when a speaker concludes, if you would use the chat feature to ask questions, and Lindsay will try to handle that, and I'll help if I can. We prefer you stay muted during the call and not chime in, but if you can't help yourself, understandable. So with that, Stephen, you want to lead us off today, and thank you very, very much. I know you're a busy man for being here. We appreciate it.
Sure, happy to do it. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all are staying safe and your families. I'm going to give you a quick update on what we're doing with the PPE situation, our economic impact and analysis and recovery work, and then update you on a few other miscellaneous items. So first of all, on PPE, obviously still a significant issue for our healthcare providers across the Commonwealth, as well as our first responders. We secured several proposals for third-party support and PPE expertise, supply chain, procurement, and so forth for the administration to consider. They selected a team from McKinsey that they brought in a few days ago to advise and coordinate on 4 particular PPE-related opportunities. One is improving transparency into Virginia's PPE requirements, developing a comprehensive model of both supply and demand. 2, sourcing additional supply from in-state industry, working with Gen Edge and VMA and others. 3rd, identifying and acquiring supply from non-medical end users. That's both donations, working with VEDP, as well as out-of-state and out-of-country manufacturers. And finally, 4th, sharing best practices on PPE demand management. So that's going to add some real capacity to our work statewide. VEDP's role really will continue to be mostly outreach to companies that could either be sources of donations or of new supply. And our BI team, our BRE team in particular this week, will be taking the lead on that. So we're happy to be a part of that team, working with many others. We are continuing our work with the Economic Crisis Strike Force, led by Secretary Ball, looking at both economic impact as well as starting to think about economic recovery. Doing a lot of analysis of Virginia data, tracking what's going on nationwide, and doing some of our own takes on this, including outreach to folks in Virginia. In general, most economists are expecting a very large drop in GDP and employment in the current quarter, April to June, with the recovery starting as early as next quarter, getting back to a semi-normal in 2021. Lots of different types of activity have actually obviously dropped. I think most concerning perhaps is the big drop in consumer confidence. So I do think that while the initial impacts were largely constrained to hospitality and retail, we're starting to see more and more of a cascade into other industry sectors. Looking at recovery, economists surveyed by the Wall Street Journal, close to half expect the recovery to begin in the next quarter, the July to September quarter. Most of the rest expect recovery to begin the last quarter of this current calendar year. We are seeing obviously continued visibility for the next now in Virginia have been in the hospitality and retail sector. The concentration of those losses in terms of new unemployment claims as a percentage of baseline employment have varied quite a bit across Virginia. I would say in general, two big drivers for those that have been more heavily impacted. The biggest, of course, being those localities and regions that have more hospitality, like Williamsburg, like Hampton Roads, for example, seeing bigger impacts. Also, in some of our smaller regions like Southern Virginia, bigger impacts when, at least a percentage impacts when, one or more big employers announces a temporary shutdown, like with Goodyear in the Danville area or a Volvo Group in Pulaski. We are modeling what impact will be both from our own analysis as well as looking at third-party analyses as well. I'm just trying to bring up one of those here. It of course varies quite a bit by industry sector, but the really big impacts anticipated, obviously everything in hospitality, the strong majority of retail already laid off or about to be. Construction initially was modestly impacted, but is getting more and more impacted. I think in general, what we're seeing is that most of the projects that were underway are being completed, but then very little to come in, after those projects are completed. Very little to zero new residential, new commercial, new industrial, largely, not happening. But the projects underway continuing. Personal services getting a big hit. Even in healthcare, while the hospitals themselves are doing well, we're seeing lots of kind of ancillary layoffs in sort of outpatient clinics, in dental offices, and that kind of thing. And then just other impacts kind of cascading across the economy. So we're going to continue to watch that and those trends and try to anticipate those. Right now, we would expect total new unemployment claims in Virginia to be somewhere in excess of 500,000 within a couple weeks, within 2 or 3 weeks, I'd say. Potentially much larger. It's going to depend a bit to how the federal stimulus plays out and how quickly it comes as well. And of course, again, those impacts are going to vary by region, by locality. Last thing I'd mention on economic impact is the impacts that we're seeing vary greatly by demographics. So in this first wave, most of those have been most heavily impacted will receive unemployment benefits comparable or larger than what they were getting on the job. So that's good news. But as this cascades further and we see more white collar layoffs, that's not going to be as true. People will certainly get the unemployment benefits and the supplemental benefits, but they absolutely will not be made whole. Again, in this first big wave of impact, strong majority, roughly 80% or so or more, have been folks with less than a bachelor's degree, less than 20%, those with a bachelor's degree or above. Impacts similar by gender, pretty similar by race as well, although somewhat higher minority impact on these severe impact sectors, as you have a lot of lower income folks that are in that category working in frontline positions. So that's what's going on from an economic impact perspective. One of the things that we're putting a lot of work into over the last couple of weeks, particularly led by our economic competitiveness team, is working on recommendations for economic recovery, both things that Virginia can do, but also things that the federal government can do, because we are in a position where probably in any scenario, our budget is going to be under tremendous pressure and we don't have the ability to borrow for operations. Much of what we're going to be looking to do is to influence the next round of federal relief. State budget situation, shifting gears, revenues definitely aren't going to be clear for another couple of weeks. And there's a big question continuing on the size and flexibility of federal dollars with the likelihood of another round of support that will hopefully be helpful. I did want to highlight again our international trade weekly webinar series is continuing. Check out our website for details. And despite everything going on with the coronavirus situation, we are continuing our work across all our divisions, lead generation, RFPs, RFIs, marketing efforts, and even project decisions continuing as before with some adjustments. In fact, we're actually on track to exceed our job and capital investment targets for this year, but we continue to see a big drop in lead generation activity, principally because of the cancellation of trade shows and in-person marketing missions that were planned from this month through June. Last, I wanted to mention that the administration wants to basically postpone all economic development announcements from the state at this time. That includes not just from the governor, but from VEDP as well. However, they've emphasized we don't want to hold up any business transactions, lease signings, hiring, etc. So those things can move forward. We essentially just need to confirm with each project that they've made a decision for Virginia, and our team can provide an email that they may proceed without penalty with that project as needed. So they can go ahead and go forward and create those jobs. I think there's just a hesitation to do sort of public announcements at the present time. But once we get past this current phase of social distancing, I think that will loosen a bit. Those are the major updates I had, Mr. President. Happy to take any questions or comments you all may have for us.
Stephen, thank you very much. I did see a question come in. Lindsay, can you see that?
Yeah, it's from Jenna. Stephen, can you see it, or you want me to read it?
Yeah, I can see it. Hold on one second here. Let's see. Yeah, so the administration is definitely going to allow, let me back up a second. I think most of you that have been involved with VDP announcements in the past know that the incentive programs, at least in practice, have required a coordinated announcement. In this case, because of mitigating circumstances with COVID-19, the administration is going to allow projects to proceed without an announcement, provided that we've aligned on that expectation ahead of time. I think the other question from Jenna French had to do with inability of IDAs and EDAs to be able to meet virtually, other than just dealing with matters of emergency. And as far as I know, there's not really a workaround on that at this point. It's also a question from Stephanie Landrum. Let's see, Stephen, is your crisis team going to be feeding ideas, recommendations to the governor as part of his request proposals yesterday to create funding for businesses? Who's going to help shape how that money is spent? Assuming the GA agrees with the proposal and it moves forward. I'm not sure what the reference, I must have missed if there was something the governor announced yesterday, but we have been asked to make recommendations to the administration, which we've already done a number of those. We'll be doing more again today, but then ultimately it'll be up to obviously the governor and his team what they decide to pass on to Congress. Question about our team developing economic recovery recommendations. Is there a timeline when those will be presented? We're sharing, we've already shared a number of them with the administration. We'll be sharing more today. I think because substantially all of them would really require administration action. I would have to, either state administration action or federal. I'd have to defer to the administration on how they would want to share those things. Keith Boswell says, if we have recommendations, should we send them to you? Yes, feel free to send it to me or to Jason Alcubi or Sean Brazier, who's leading our economic competitiveness team, or Kristen Morton. We'll all get it to the right place. Is there any state funding beyond Tobacco Commission for companies considering expanding who already provide PPE or supporting materials? We certainly continue to have all of our incentive programs available for, for company expansions. I'm not sure what else was being referenced here. And I will keep tracking the comments as the webinar continues. So if there are any other comments or questions for VDP, I can respond to those later on in the webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephen. Really appreciate it. Beard's looking good too, like the quarantine look. Okay, and Stephen will be around. So if you do have questions, you can continue to send them in, and Lindsay and I will try to track them and get them to him a little bit later. Our next speaker is Jody Keenan with the Small Business Development Center. And Jody, before you start, I just want to thank you and your team. The information you've been pumping out has been incredibly helpful to me as a local ED director, and we've been posting a lot of it and great feedback from our businesses. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me again. I didn't prepare. I do have slides, but I didn't send them in, so I'm just going to read through them real quickly. Just an update on the EIDL Advance and Loan Program. This is the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Advance, the $10,000 and the loan in general. And then I'll give you an update on SBDC funding and just make a brief reference to the Federal Reserve Main Street lending facility that was released, I think, last week. And I don't know much about it, but I do want to mention it. Okay, the EIDL Advance. There's been a lot of confusion around this $10,000 free grant or advance that was available or is available. So I just wanted to give you all the current availability. It is up to $10,000. It's $1,000 per employee with a $10,000 max. And the per employee is, so a part-time equals a full-time. So $1,000 per employee up to $10,000 would be eligible for the business to request and get advanced on. And it's a grant. It doesn't need to be repaid. If you get the EIDL, or excuse me, if the business gets a full EIDL loan, they don't need to repay the $10,000, and the $10,000 would be in addition to a full EIDL loan. The other change that was announced last week related to the EIDL is that while borrowers can qualify for up to loan amounts of up to $2 million, right now, in an effort to ensure that as many businesses as possible have access to those funds, at least that's what we're being told. The EIDL loan is right now being capped at 2 months of working capital with a maximum of $15,000. So it's being couched as an initial payment to the borrower. So if they've been approved for more than that, I'd anticipate that if more funds are provided to SBA for this program, that the borrowers would be able to increase their amount. But right now it's capped at 2 months of working capital or $15,000. And I appreciate that is a huge disappointment for most businesses, and it has not really been communicated. Well, it was communicated late last week. So we've been working with companies on that front as well. And I think, Zach will talk about the PPP, so I won't go into that program. But continue to encourage businesses to reach out to us or to just go ahead and apply for the funds, knowing those two points of clarification. The piece, and I guess I'll take questions too. I'll look in the chat. I don't see anything yet, but I'll look in the chat for that. The piece I wanted to just share with you related to the funding for the Small Business Development Center network. The way that we receive funding is through the Small Business Administration, and for every dollar we receive of federal money, we match that with a non-federal dollar. And in Virginia, most of that match comes from our host organizations, whether it's a university or college or economic development or a chamber. It comes from that. And then a great portion of almost 50% of our 50% match comes from you all and your partners around the Commonwealth. So I understand and realize the fiscal constraints that you all are facing in your communities, and would just ask if you're anticipating a review or a change in the funding level for your local SBDC, that you let me or the center know when you know, so that we can plan accordingly. We are getting additional federal money through the CARES Act. We're getting about $4.6 million that will not require match at all. It will be available. We're getting ready to apply for it now. It'll be available for us to expand our capacity, hire more staff between now and September of 2021. So we'll have additional resources, but if we don't have our core funds and we use this money to just replace those missing dollars, or people or resources, I should say, then we're not able to really expand capacity. It becomes a net sum zero. I mean, there's just no increase. So again, I would just, I respect we're all in very difficult times. So the sooner you have a sense of if you're funding the local SBDC, if that's going to continue or change or alter in any way, please feel free to reach out to me just to give me a heads up, but also the local center. And then the only other piece I wanted to mention, there was some information that came out from the Fed last week regarding, it's called Main Street Lending, and just wanted to make sure you realized or knew that that money is actually to shore up the financial institutions, to allow them to have some additional guarantee when they're making their PPP loans. So it's not for borrowers, when they see this, they think maybe that I can just go to the Fed and get a loan for my Main Street business, and that's not how it works. But the other piece that they announced or that they have is a municipal facility liquidity program. And I just mentioned that if you all are interested, the Fed is very interested in talking with you all or the appropriate folks in your jurisdictions about the benefits of that program, if it makes sense. And again, that's all I'm using vocabulary that I don't know. So, but I just wanted to put a plug in there for the Fed that they're very accessible in Richmond and eager to make sure you and your colleagues in the jurisdictions know about that program. So there's anyway, if I can connect you with them, I'm happy to do that. That's all I have. If there's questions, I'll take them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll just go on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Jody, Betty Mitchell asked, do you know of anyone who has actually gotten money from EIDL or PPP?
I don't know EIDL. We have had some companies who have gotten a PPP loan, yes.
And then Leah Freeman just stated that VCC has gotten through 74 PPP loans and sent them to SBA, and it was 14.8 million as of Sunday. Greg asked, he apologizes if he missed it, but is there an update on the timing of the receipt of the funding for the EIDL grant loan and PPP loan?
Well, the EIDL was supposed to be approved. If it was approved, it would also be then dispersed within 45 days of application. I don't think we're up to that 45-day period yet, and I haven't heard that it's been filed. The grant program was supposed to be reviewed in 3 days. That clearly hasn't happened. The latest I saw is that it would be reviewed within 5 days, but that doesn't mean disbursement. So that's a long-winded answer to no change, and I don't have any on that.
Then Ryan Toole asked, will any of the additional 4.6 million be allocated to local SBDCs or just supporting the state office? If it will be allocated, how and when?
Most of it will be allocated to local offices. We are submitting a proposal now, getting ready to do that to SBA for April 24th. Then a couple of weeks to turn it around before we get the approval. So I would expect by the end of May, we will be able to issue the award to the local centers.
Leonard Sledge asked, can any of the 4.6 million in new funding be used to temporarily stand up SBDC operations in regions that do not currently have an SBDC operation?
We can expand capacity there, Leonard, in your region. And we have funds set aside to stand up an office in Richmond. So we can certainly talk about that. But we're not looking to open up new offices. Richmond has a hole right now, but we're not looking to open up new offices. We're looking to expand the capacity and hire more people in our existing offices other than the Richmond location.
Sarah Worley asked, can you repeat the new EIDL cap?
Sure. It's 2 months of working capital up to $15,000.
Morgan Ingram said, you did say that the EIDL advance amount will be forgiven. Since it is $1,000 per employee, would a sole proprietor only be able to apply for $1,000?
Right. That's what they would be eligible for, correct.
Okay, I think that's all we have right now. Jody, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I know you guys are hyper busy too. And can you hang on, Jody, if there's questions related to you and downstream? Okay, very good. All right, well, we're going to move to our next speaker, Zachary Petrie with Virginia Community Capital. Zach, are you online?
Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Great.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. So I think my vantage point where I'll add value to this is that of the lender's perspective during the SBA Paycheck Protection Program rollout. So the interim rule came out, what was it? It was 2 Thursdays ago. That was April 2nd, to lenders to provide guidance on the program that would open up the next morning. And so there was a mad rush among lenders, as I'm sure you've followed in the news, to try and get that ball rolling. And so there's kind of 2 phases to the, I'm going to say the PPP loans to save time. So there's 2 phases. There's the getting the loan deployed, and then there's phase 2, which is getting the loan forgiven. And so that forgiveness component is triggered after about 8 weeks of using the proceeds from that loan towards eligible payroll costs. So the guidelines on how to process those loans, that's been what the SBA has been focusing on with the Treasury Department and clarifying to their lenders. There's still clarification needed on how to book these. And so where the majority of the lenders in the nation, they're working on getting those SBA loan numbers, because those applicants spot in line on it. Hopefully there will be more guidelines on that. A lot of lenders are moving forward with their familiarity with the SBA if they've been an SBA lender in the past. VCC has. So we're familiar with working with them, and we've done some kind of workarounds on how to get those booked. There are, as Leah Freemow had mentioned in the notes, VCC's done. We've probably by tonight we'll have close to 100 SBA loan numbers issued, which is great for us, and super proud of our team for being able to do that, because we're not a huge organization, but it's not even a drop in the bucket for what's needed. And so the large lending institutions, I've talked with some of my friends over there at different institutions, Atlantic Union, and that are having, tens of thousands of applicants. They're now getting to the point where they have their processes in place, and I think they're really starting to churn, which is great for our communities because we need those large institutions to do so. In order to book these loans, that the lender needs to be in BSA compliance. So Bank Secrecy Act compliance requires requires a lot of additional paperwork to book these loans, to make sure that there's no money laundering going on, that there's not fraudulent behavior. So booking a loan for a new client that you don't have that information on is going to take a lot longer. And that's the reason that a lot of lenders have opened it up first and foremost and prioritize their existing clients, because it'll be a faster process. Now, I think some of those larger institutions are opening it up to non-clients that are willing to open up a deposit account with them. And so I think Atlantic Union has done that, which is wonderful. So as long as the small business or the nonprofit is able to open up a deposit account with that lender, then they are eligible for a loan with Atlantic Union. And I wouldn't be surprised if other lending institutions open it up that way as well. Where we are in deploying the $349 billion, as of this morning, there was about $215 billion out. That number will continue to uptick as more lenders jump on board. So I think, as y'all are working with small businesses and nonprofits in your community, the key takeaway is get in a queue. call your lender that you work with, your bank, and ask them if they're participating. If they're not participating, a good list of lenders to start checking in with would be the SBA lender list, which you can find on the SBA's website. Other lenders are eligible to provide this product. So if your bank is not on that list, they still may have opted to provide this product. So it's worth a call into them. The point is, nonprofits and small businesses just need to get in the queue. $350 probably runs out this week, but there's another $250 billion that is all indicators are pointing that the other thing that as you're working with, I'm trying to think of what would be valuable information for y'all, and I'm thinking most of y'all are going to be kind of the advising and consultation side to the nonprofits and the businesses you're working with. And so I'll answer any questions as they come through. But one of the other things is ensuring that as they're calculating what they're requesting, that they're understanding what's forgivable. So effectively, they're finding their average monthly payroll costs, and the SBA provides guidance on how you calculate that. And they're getting 2.5 times that amount. And then over the next 8 weeks from the time that loan is issued, they are to spend that money, at least 75% of it on payroll. They can spend the rest of it on rent, utilities, other overhead expenses, but at least 75% of it has to be for payroll for it to be forgiven. Also, the number of employees needs to stay the same. Also, compensation levels need to stay the same. Now, there hasn't been guidance issued on clarifying, well, if you have to let someone go, you have to let someone go. How much will my forgiveness come down due to that? And so those guidelines have not been provided, but it's important that the applicant understand as they're applying for this, making sure that they're able to utilize forgiveness, because this loan could be 100% forgiven. And at the end of the day, the applicant pays nothing for this. It's effectively a grant. So want to make sure that they're optimizing that as best as possible. What they're submitting for applications to banks, typically it's going to be, if they're using a payroll service, a lot of these larger payroll services have created reports for the PPP loans. So they can just run a report, and the majority of what they need to evidence, number of employees, compensation levels. You can't include the amount over $100,000 per salaried person. If you do have them over 100,000, you can't include that amount. So that report should take that out. So if they have a payroll servicing company that they work with, that's a pretty quick way to get that component. If they don't, and they need to evidence their employee level as well as their salary, their compensation levels, prior year tax return is good. Or they can also provide their payroll tax filings, the 940s and 941s. Those will suffice as well. And then depending on the lending institution, they may need more information. Like VCC, we would like to see their company prepared balance sheet and profit and loss statement for the last 2 months if they have it. For the first 2 months of the calendar year if they have it. And then the BSA compliance component comes in. If they're not an existing client, they're going to need to provide Social Security numbers on all signers, so we'll say all signers for nonprofits because there's no one that owns the nonprofit. So we're not looking at an ownership structure to determine who's going to sign. It's who's ever designated in the bylaws. So the bank's going to need to see all the org documents that designate who is the authorized signer. Going to need to see the Social Security number on those signers, a copy of the driver's license for them as well. And then for the for-profit entities where they do have ownership percentages, anyone that's 25% or more owner will need to comply with beneficiary ownership regulations, which is the driver's license and the Social Security number and things like that. So as you're talking with them, this is a lot of information. Just tell them, just if they haven't started getting things together, I either working with their CPA or their CFO to try and get all this documentation together and just find a lender that's taking an application and get in their queue as soon as possible. So I'll leave it at that because I think that's enough information. I'll answer any questions if y'all have them now, or I'm also going to stay on so I can answer them later too.
Zach, thank you. That's great advice. I did have one quick question before Lindsay jumps in because there's a couple chat questions, but I thought 1% interest on the principal you did have to pay back. It wasn't entirely forgivable.
It is entirely forgivable. If say an applicant ends up using only 50% for payroll costs and that other component is not forgivable, then it stays on the book of that lending institution at 1%. And so you're right, they would have to pay. The first 6 months of it is deferred with interest accruing. So they would have to pay that interest that's accrued and then start making regular P&I payments.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
all right.
Good question.
Lindsay?
Yeah, just for those on the phone, Betty Mitchell asked, early on we were told any 501c3 was eligible for EIDL. Now we're hearing only 501c3s are eligible, which is correct. Jody responded and said 501c3s are the only eligible nonprofits for EIDL and PPP. Faith-based organizations are also eligible. Ryan Toole asked Zachary, would it be possible for you to share your documentation tips with VEDA for us to distribute?
Sure, I can. Who do I send that to?
You can send it. You can reply to that email that we sent earlier prior to the meeting.
Okay.
Thanks.
Connie Long would be the person, Zach, to send it to.
Okay, I'll send that.
Okay. I don't see any other questions. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's
Lindsay?
all I have.
Okay. I don't know if Chris is back from lunch.
Yep, I'm right here. No,
there he is. Chris, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks. And I'll actually, if I might, Jim, if you don't mind, there were today, not only will I talk about the site selection stuff, but today's the day we now have found out about all the governor's amendments. And that's why I was off screen, but because I was looking up those. So some of this I'll start actually with a policy update for folks because I think it'll be helpful. Understand that we do not have all the information yet. The amendments are still being posted literally as I speak. And so I don't have answers for everything, but I can answer some of the questions that were asked earlier of Stephen because literally they're just being put up. First on FOIA, and I have to look this up, so just bear with me. The governor did propose an amendment. It's in the caboose bill and the regular budget bill. We don't know exactly the language. It's just in his cover letter. He says that he will have provisions. It specifically says provisions for public bodies to meet electronically when circumstances related to an emergency, such as social distancing, make it impractical to meet in a single location. So there is going to be some provision that I would assume would provide or apply to all economic development bodies, boards of supervisors, but we should later today. There was a question about the small skill machines. It would actually allow those skill machines to stay for another year or almost a year, and it would tax them and generate $150 million. And that would go into something that legislation just got put up called the COVID-19 fund, which, at least as the newspapers described, is used for healthcare and for small business assistance. The parameters of what the COVID-19 fund, how big the grants can be, who's going to run it and all are still not available yet. I'm assuming that will come out somewhere in the budget document. But we do know there is some sort of small business fund that's going to be created if the General Assembly does agree with the governor's amendments on that. It's not clear exactly what the governor did with regards to reducing various budgets because, again, a lot of the details aren't there yet. Essentially, any discretionary money was taken away, so new programs. So probably, again, we don't have details, but new spending, whether it be the increase in funding for the Business Ready Sites Fund at VEDP, the Affordable Housing Fund at DHCD, the additional money for enterprise zone grants, those would fall in that category. Again, we do not know exactly yet all the governor's amendments. We do know the governor did propose delaying the effective date of the minimum wage bill, the collective bargaining bill, the prevailing wage bill, and many of the tax hikes. The specifically the tax hike in Hampton Roads for transit was delayed. All these are delayed till May 1st. So the minimum wage effective date goes from January 1 to May 1st. Collective bargaining gets kicked back. Prevailing wage gets kicked back. The Hampton Roads transit occupancy tax hike for transit gets kicked back till May 1st. The one in Northern Virginia for the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority is getting kicked back. And so a number of these tax hikes are being kicked back. The one here in Central Virginia is delayed until October 1st. So Clark and I will continue to pour through these, and I'm sorry I don't have more details, but the House has particularly been a little bit slow in putting up all the details. But we will get out a policy update to everybody soon, because there's a lot going on here and a lot to digest. With regards to, now I'll put on my paid hat, what I do in my real job, and that is doing site selection. And so we actually had the Site Selectors Guild, we just had an internal call last week among ourselves just to compare notes among the 48 of us, and we actually had 37 of us were on the call to talk about kind of what's going on in the site selection world. And then for the past week and a half, I've been on a series of webinars from economic development organizations around the country, just to touch base with folks about what's going on in the site selection world. So I was one Atlanta last week, a group in Iowa, a group in the Panhandle of Florida, and then a group in Sacramento on Friday. I'm with New Orleans right after this call. And so I'm getting a pretty good sense of what's going on around the country with regards to site selection. What we're hearing from the Guild, and then what I'm hearing from everybody, and it kind of goes along with what Stephen said, activity level is still generally strong. People are still issuing RFIs. I issued one last week for an industrial project in the Midwest. People are still kicking tires. If you're in hospitality or anything linked to hospitality, it's really soft right now. In fact, most of those projects have been pulled. Office is a little bit up in the air because people don't know exactly when we're going to get back and what the office of the post-COVID world is going to look like. Logistics remains very, very strong. And food and beverage remains very, very strong. A lot of the plants that are out there are having a hard time keeping up. And now you've got some plants being closed around the country because they've had COVID outbreaks. So, how the system reacts to that remains to be seen. What a lot of our colleagues are saying, again, restaurant and hospitality is especially weak. For those of you in your community, brick and mortar retail, this is probably going to be the thing that pushes a lot of brick and mortar retails off the edge. I remember after Christmas, I told my wife if she had any Macy's returns to go ahead and make them, because I didn't think Macy's would be around the rest of the year. This is going to probably be the thing that puts Macy's, Gap, GameStop, Bed Bath & Beyond, some of those other chains, Kohl's, a lot of them were already on the way out. This is going to be the thing that pushes them. So for those of you at the local level, thinking about how you repurpose those buildings is an issue that a lot of people all around the country are thinking about, because you're just going to have this mass exodus. Those leases are people are just going to walk away from them. These big box and other stores are going to be a challenge. Where people are seeing opportunities, and again, in addition to logistics and food manufacturing, cold storage, believe it or not, there's just this incredible demand out there for cold storage, and it's neither it's port related. So if you're closer to a port that has a strong food export, that's very strong, but just cold storage generally. Data centers remains extremely strong. And so obviously Virginia is well positioned for that. There's a lot of question on whether pharmaceutical will start to relocate to the United States. I think everybody feels like it could. Remember, 90% of the base pharmaceuticals that we use in this country are made in China. And I don't know that people are going to allow that to happen anymore. But whether the pharmaceutical companies really bring it back, or do they just produce a lot and store it here in the United States for an event like this, similar on PPE and medical supply. A lot of it's made in China. Are we going to really see it come back to the United States for manufacture? Or are you just going to manufacture a whole lot in China or Vietnam or Malaysia and just store it in the United States, so we don't have these short supply chains or short challenges? A lot of people think that the trends we saw coming into this, about artificial intelligence, the growth of e-commerce and automation, are just going to be exacerbated by what we're doing. Again, industrial remains relatively strong. Again, logistics remains strong. CBRE did a really good call last week where they were talking about, not only Amazon, but everybody in the logistics space, all the REITs, Prologis, Duke, are all closing deals and continuing to take down property. So that remains especially strong. That is quickly on the top. The only other category that keeps coming up when in these site selection calls and others is the question about universities, because universities are big economic engines. And how is this with the shift to online learning? Is this going to be something that really causes universities to have to transform? And if a lot of universities are either closed by this or shift to an online portion, which I think a lot of people would like to see from an affordability perspective, what does that mean from an economic impact perspective for the host communities for universities? So that's something to think about as we're going forward. With that, Jim, I'd be glad to take any questions.
Chris, thank you very, very much. That was very helpful. Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Yeah. The only question is Betty Mitchell asked, and anybody can answer this on the panel, but is there any help about the process of asking for an exception to FMLA if you are under 50 employees?
I don't know, Betty. I think it's handled by the Department of Labor, but I don't know if you go online somewhere or if you go to the VEC. I'll look for that for you. I've actually tried looking for it myself, and I'm just not getting the right resource. So I'll see if I can find it.
Hey, Jim.
Yes.
Jim, this is Chris Lloyd.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, one thing I'm sorry I forgot to address was somebody did ask if there were other incentives other than the tobacco for PPE.
Right.
One thing I forgot to address is the Go Virginia board is going to be meeting electronically this Friday, and they are looking at initiatives in that space. So we'll obviously update that as soon as the board acts on that. But there is the possibility of converting some of the funds for doing something in that space. So we'll keep you posted.
Excellent.
Chris, there was a question from Stephanie Landrum, and she asked, have you seen any communities or states using virtual tour tools yet?
Yeah, I am starting to see that. I'm still a touch it, feel it kind of guy, so you want to get out and do it. But that's absolutely happening in the commercial real estate space. They talked about that extensively on the CBRE call last week. And some of the guild members said they're starting to do some site tours virtually. And some of the economic development organizations I've been on the phone with said that they're starting to put together virtual tours for people, that they're either pulling something out of stock right now or they're trying to go out and produce something for site tours. So it is starting to happen.
Those on the phone, Elizabeth Povar posted, just a heads up for all, Virginia Tech is sponsoring a webinar on April 30th from 10 a.m. to noon. Aimed at local government finance managers and local government executives to overview the COVID impact on small businesses and hear from resource partners such as local chambers, regional RDOs, state small business development centers on how these orgs are working together to help businesses re-enter the new economy. So that was April 30th and it's being sponsored by Virginia Tech.
Great. Thank you, Lindsay. I don't see any other questions on the chat line. This is your opportunity. Have 4 great resources here.
Chris, Andy Wade asks, is there any insight on the Go Virginia State Board recommendation that would redirect statewide competitive funds for a statewide region-led response to the economic crisis brought on by the pandemic?
Yeah, that's what you're going to see before the board on Friday, is some initiatives in that way. So they're looking at taking the statewide competitive money for FY20 and reprogramming them towards or making them available for a regional recovery and resiliency fund. So a lot of the details are still being worked out, but we'll have a lot more after the board meeting on Friday.
Stephen, do you see, oh, sorry, Chris.
No, that's okay, Lindsay, go ahead.
I was going to say, Stephen, do you see Sarah Hodges' question? You're on mute, Stephen.
Sorry. Sarah asked, has there been any discussion on relaxation of targets, especially employment goals for current state incentive packages and performance agreements? We need our board to meet to be able to do something formally kind of across the board. But in general, what we're envisioning is being, reasonable and flexible around extension requests. I don't think at the moment that we'd want to reduce job targets, but we will look at extensions, and we may revisit the job target piece later on.
Chris, I think that question might go to you too for Go Virginia if you happen to know.
I know that the staff is looking at, the DHCD staff is right now looking through all the performance agreements that they have in the contracts to see if there is the opportunity to look at that. And I think they're going to detail that more on the meeting on Friday. Lindsay, if I might, one other thing I forgot to suggest is one thing we're also starting to see, or I'm starting to see some local and regional economic development groups doing around the country. I just saw the first few starting last week, is people are now kind of shifting to what does recovery look like. And so, you're seeing some of them pivot towards, putting into place, a planning process or convening a task force around those kind of initiatives. So those of you who are out there at the local and regional level, it's time to start thinking about that. Thanks.
That's great advice, Chris.
Stephen, one more question from Liz Povar.
Oh yeah, I was starting to reply. We've canceled the March board meeting, and we're about to cancel the April board meeting for a couple of reasons. One, we can only discuss topics that are directly connected to we can only discuss the emergency declaration. And B, critically, the meeting would have to be open to the public and the media. And so the kinds of discussions the board would like to have just are not going to work in that context. So we are in regular communications with the board, and I'm also reaching out to each of our board members individually.
And then one more from Scott Sutton.
What are some ways the private sector can help now in economic development efforts? Well, it depends very much on the kind of company and whether, the first thing is to stay alive themselves and try to keep their employees on board as much as they can. I think for those that have PPE that they can stand to let go, I think donating to their local hospitals, if it's in small, or first responders, if it's in small quantities, if it's in large quantities, donating through the state, which we can help coordinate to get to the areas of greatest need. I think continuing to the extent that they're able financially to support their local and regional economic development groups. In general, Virginia has kind of a miniature economic development apparatus to begin with, and it would definitely hurt those groups to lose the funding that they have now. Those are some of the things that come to mind initially.
I like that last comment, Stephen. Thank you very much. I don't want to rush it. We're here till 2, but if there's no more questions, any last well, let me just say, if you're contemplating a last question, we do plan to do this again. We're going to continue to do these on Mondays at 12:30. We're lining up future speakers. If you have an idea for somebody you think would be highly relevant, please reach out to Connie. By looking at the chat, everyone, all the speakers' comments were greatly appreciated today. Very, very helpful. I know they were for me. And I want to thank you all for taking the time. We know how busy everyone is. I do have one last announcement. Today is Connie's birthday, and I don't know if she's on the line or not via phone. I am not going to try to lead a Zoom happy birthday, but please send Connie your birthday wishes. Personally, couldn't do this without her. Thank you, Connie. Have a great day. And unless there's something else, I think we're done. Thank you, speakers. Much, much appreciated. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lindsay.